Right, we've seen two examples, more or less at the same time, 1830, 1832, of ways in which the political systems were changed, adapted, mostly to give some power and influence to the middle classes in England and France. In both cases, the working class still were not in a very powerful position. Okay, one was through, to some extent, revolution. The other one was through reform, two themes we've been looking at. So that brings us to 1848. Can anyone remember what happened also in 1848? I mentioned it on Wednesday, I guess, last time. Communist Manifesto was published in 1848. Okay, so Marx and Engels were kind of writing, as I said then, at a revolutionary time. There were further revolutions in Western and Central Europe in this year, another revolutionary year, okay, a very important year in that respect. Again, we have economic problems as a background. And I should say that probably, I can't say this is the true for every single case, because we can't generalize in history in this way, but in many cases where we have revolution, whether it's 1848 in France or Germany, whether it's the Iranian Revolution or the Russian Revolution, in all revolutions, normally I would expect there to be some kind of economic and financial problem because people are hungry. When people are hungry, okay, they are not happy, and then they are critical of the government. If there is economic prosperity, if most people are okay, and their stomachs are full, and their kids are eating well, then people will say, okay, let's not cause any trouble, we won't have a revolution. They don't feel, even if they're not happy with the government, even if they don't like the government, if they're doing okay themselves, they probably won't have a revolution. So in many cases, and I'm not saying this is a law we can apply to history because that kind of thing doesn't exist, but in many cases, one of the background causes, one of the background factors is economic problems. In addition, there were political problems, okay, because still in many parts of Europe, despite the revolutions of 1830 in France and elsewhere, okay, many people still had very little political power and influence, okay, and they wanted, again, changes, particularly in ways that elections were made to various systems. So there was still pressure on that. So in France, again, we can begin with France again, okay, the same story. Despite having this constitutional monarchy as it was set up 18 years earlier, there was quite a lot of discontent. People were not happy with the government. There is protests, political agitation. People are going into the streets and complaining. Okay, the government then tries to control that, and it breaks out into violence. And February 1848, technically the monarchy is destroyed, and instead they set up Second Republic. First Republic was with the French Revolution, okay, when they removed the royal family for the first time, and now for the second time they set up another republic. They set up another non-monarchy system of controlling the country. They feel that the July monarchy, as we're calling it, from 1830 is not doing enough, particularly for lower classes and so on. Chuck Yasha. So again, we have a big change through violence in France. However, within a few years, by 1852, in fact, so within 3 or 4 years or so of these changes, a man called Louis Napoleon, who was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, effectively set himself up as emperor. Okay, so just as Napoleon Bonaparte had kind of changed subverted the French Revolution. So in the same way, his nephew Louis does the same thing to the revolution of 1848, steps himself up as kind of ruler, as dictator, and so on. We won't go into the details of that again here, but that's very important. Okay, once again, the idea gets changed and so on. So what you see in France is political problems leading to political change, okay, and in this case, extreme change. They just get rid of the monarchy. We've had these cases before. And again, it's not just France, though we often begin with France. We often start the story with France. Again, we have riots and fighting in Italy. What else have we got? In Germany, in what is now Austria, okay, the Habsburg Empire, we mentioned them, in what is now Switzerland, and even in Denmark. Okay? So in many areas we have riots and fighting. The changes in some places constitutional, lead to constitutional changes. In other cases we have some slightly more violent changes and so on going on. So 1848, because of economic and political problems, was a very nasty year to be living in most parts of Europe. Okay? And we see in the case of France most notably these changes. So again, just to stress, it's at that time that Marx is living. He must have been really excited. He must have thought that maybe the socialist revolution really is going to happen. He must have been thinking it was almost going to happen and so on. Perhaps the fact that it didn't in many areas led him to write that book where he stresses the problems and things like that. Okay, and very lastly, for this, we jump forward in time a little bit more recently to look at what I'm calling an attempt at reform. Okay, an attempt at doing some constitutional changes in Russia. Russia, in the east of Europe, always a bit different from what's going on in the West. Okay, having different institutions, different traditions, and so on, not following what the Western Europeans are kind of doing. This man was Tsar Alexander II. He was the Tsar of Russia. Okay, and the period we're looking at is the 1860s and 70s, so slightly later than we've been looking at with Western Europe. But here is his attempts to do some things, to make some changes. And this is the period when he and his government tried to make some changes to political and social life in Russia and make some reforms. One of these, 1861, the abolition of serfdom. Do we know what a serf is? Say that again?
A peasant works on land but doesn't own it and has a master.
Yes, it's not quite a slave, because that's perhaps going too far, but it's someone who is a farm worker, living and working in the countryside. Usually they don't own the land, but they work on the land for someone else. Okay, they are someone else's farmer or something like that. Okay, so they kind of effectively belong to that piece of land of someone else. So if I own the land, then you're all my serfs, and you have to work for me on that land as well. Okay. And what they tried to do was to get rid of that system. Serfdom is the system of having people tied to the land and having to work for their landowner, their master on that land. So he tried to abolish that. That's one example. They also tried to set up local elective assemblies. So in the local areas of the Russian Empire, okay, so not centrally here, but each locality would have a group of people who would get together periodically, who were elected by people living locally, to represent their ideas and to discuss local issues. Okay.
Did everyone allowed to vote?
No, there would be some control. I don't know the details, but it would not be everyone. You wouldn't get the poorer people again. It would be like well, you missed the first class, but like we saw in Britain or whatever, there would be some kind of control. I don't think it was universal suffrage, but landowners, wealthier people wealthy peasants and things like that would probably get a chance to somehow elect their assemblies, as far as I know. It's not completely democratic in a modern sense, but it's moving in that direction. So we can't expect big changes overnight. So these are two examples. This was 1864, I think. A few years later, they tried to set up these assemblies and so on. They were not perfect, however. They were by no means perfect changes in the system. For example, one of the problems is they said you can't be a serf anymore, but what you had to do was you had to buy your freedom away from the land. Okay? In order to escape, you had to have money. But most of these serfs didn't have land or money, so most of them ended up still working on the same land for the same guy, except they weren't called serfs anymore. But effectively, it was the same thing. They hadn't really changed their situation very much. So it was a kind of theory, but not a practice. By 1873, however, the Tsar and his government were getting a little bit nervous. They were getting a little bit worried about things. Okay? They were worried that if they give too many freedoms to people, that they might start to make bigger changes. You give something to someone, then they want more. Then you give that to them, and they want more. Okay? So they were nervous that perhaps they were going too far in some of these changes, that somehow their own position might be challenged. So then they stopped making reforms, and they cancelled the whole reforming program, in effect, 1873. And that, I think, was probably a mistake, because what they'd done to the people of the Russian Empire is they'd given them a taste of what they could have, and then they'd taken it away. Okay? We made that same mistake with our dog. We have small Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, and we used to give her some of our food. Okay? Not just the köpek, yemi, the dog food, but also we'd occasionally give her something, and she'd love that. She'd dance around and things, and we'd give her the food to eat and so on. And then we realized that wasn't good for her, and the veterinarian said, no, that's not good for her heart. She's getting a little bit fat, so I have to stop. But she's had that flavor, and now it's really cruel. And she probably thinks this dog food is really boring, and I can smell what they're eating. If we hadn't done that at the beginning, then she wouldn't know anything different. Okay? She would just be used to having her own food. So I'm not suggesting that the people of Russia are the same as my dog or something like that. That would be a bad comparison. But giving anyone, anything, a flavor or a taste of something and taking it away is always a dangerous thing. And for the next 30, 40 years, okay, we get growing pressures in Russia, okay, culminating finally 1917, of course, in the Russian Revolution, the complete removal of the Tsar and so on, and the arrival of the communists. And probably, at least partly, this decision to cancel the reform contributed to that, because you just created this desire for more change and so on, and some people were able to use that. There was agitation afterwards. There were complaints and fighting. And in fact, Alexander himself, I think, was assassinated, was killed by a bomb, someone who was not happy with what was going on. So that reflects that situation. They didn't manage that situation very well. So this is an example of kind of reform that fails. Okay? Initial reform and then taken away. Whereas, at least as we saw in Britain, they did a little reform, a little enough, and then 30 years later they make some slightly more changes to the electoral system, and they gradually change things over time. So there's never been a big revolution in Britain, in a way that in many countries, in France we've seen, but also of course in Turkey with the ending of the Ottoman Empire, you have had a revolution in that sense. Kemal Atatürk was leading a revolution in that way. In Britain, we've just gradually adapted little bits of changes over time and things like that. So this is the end of this presentation. So what we've seen is the Industrial Revolution beginning in Western Europe, Britain and elsewhere. We can see this change in the economic system. It then has a change in the social system, because people are living and working in different ways. That then puts pressure on the political system. And that's the revolutions we're looking at. In terms of the ideas, in terms of people's thinking, some people are describing the Industrial Revolution. Adam Smith mainly is just saying this is how it works. This is how division of labour works. This is how it should be for free trade or something. Okay? Other people are talking about the social results, talking about reform and so on. And other people are even wanting big change. Marx is our example of that. He wants major revolutionary change because society needs to follow that way, and so on. So it's a mixture of history and ideas feeding into each other, okay, over a period of about 100 years or more that we've seen in these cases. And we've looked at some reforms and some revolutions in a very brief way in those contexts as well. It's not all connected to the Industrial Revolution, but it's partly feeding into that. Do you have any questions or anything at the end before we... Monday we have the presentations, of course. Okay, Erdem?
Why does, in some places, this social and economic disturbance leads to a reform and somewhere else it leads to a revolution? Is this...
Right, well, you can write a whole book on this. I mean, obviously, I don't really know the answer perfectly to that. You'd have to look at each example and so on. And you can generalize about the people or whatever. I just think it's what the reactions that are going on. You could have, I mean, you did have, even in England where they made these little reforms, they did have rather violent outbreaks during the early 19th century in different places, but it never led to a major revolution and things like that. In France, they seem to almost have this tradition of having revolutions and changing back. Once they'd started it in the 18th century, it kind of carries on for 100 years or more periodically. So maybe they're just more kind of, you know, once you've done it once, it's like they always say, it's very difficult to kill someone, but once you've committed murder the first time, it's a little bit easier the next time. Maybe it's difficult to have a revolution and so on, and I don't know, I mean, a bit silly. But you need to look at each country. Every country is unique. Every country has its own history. And obviously, I've done a lot of generalizing here. I've talked very generally about things, but each one has to be looked at in its own context as well as in the broader context as well. So that's a non-answer to your question, really. Okay, let's, for the rest of the time we've got half an hour left and we may not use all that time. I want to do something somewhat different now, which is to ask you a few questions to help me more as library director rather than as history teacher. So I'm going to suggest a scenario, a situation. Now in my course, I give you essays to do, and I also give you the bibliography. Okay, so I've given you the books in the library or the internet resources that you need to read and so on for your presentations and your essays. And I've said, look at the chapter in the textbook that might help you. Okay, so I'm pointing you to most of the resources already. But imagine, just imagine, if I didn't do that, if I said, okay, we'll take our example. If I said, okay, for next week, you need to write me an essay on Karl Marx, but I'm not going to give you any bibliography. Okay? All I'm going to say is Karl Marx, Communist Manifesto, for example, okay, because that's what we're looking at. And I'm saying to you, by next Friday, you have to give me your essay. Send it to Turnitin and give it to me or something like that. Just imagine this. This is just a hypothetical situation. Now, for the next couple of minutes, just think, write on a bit of paper or something. If I did that to you, and maybe some teachers do, they just say essay or assignment or project, go away, come back next week. What would you do? Okay, what would you actually do? Where would you go? How would you start? And how would you then move on? So my question here is, where would you go? Which means physically or computer-wise, virtually, where would you go? At first, and then once you've started working on the project, afterwards. Okay? What resources, what would you look for as a starting point and as a continuing point? And try and think of this as honestly as possible. Okay? You may have been faced with this situation, I don't know. If you're given a topic to work on, whether it's a presentation, an essay, a project or something, and all you know is the title, the name, whatever it is, what would you do? Okay? Have a little think, a couple of minutes, just let everyone think about this, write some ideas down, because this is quite important. I'm not saying what should you do, I'm saying what do you do if it's happened to you in the past? What things, as in most cases, not all of you, most of you are first year Bill Kent students, what would you do? Where would you look to work on this project, on this hypothetical project? Have a little think for a minute or so, Well, or if you can keep it in your head. I'm an old man, I have to write everything down, otherwise I forget. If you can think of it and keep it in your head, then that's fine, okay? So I don't forget, I'll take the attendance. Well, so the first question is, have you ever received something like that? Has a teacher ever said, here is the project, go away and do it? Do you ever have that?
Yes.
You've had that. So you've had something where they say, go and do this, you do it all yourself. All I'm giving you is the title or the subject of the project.
He gave a question, and you have to write an essay about this question, and you have to do research about this.
Right, but she didn't say, this is the book you must use or anything. No, they just said, go and do it yourself.
I went to library, and I selected forums.
Okay. All right, so you've had this experience. You can actually then, when I ask you more detail, you can tell us what you did. The others, have you ever had this, or do you normally get some help from the teacher? Doesn't have to, I mean, even if you haven't had it, I'm still interested to know what you might do or whatever. Okay.
Personally, first of all, I would Google it, or probably, if I don't know anything about the subject, I would read it from Wikipedia.
All right.
Later, I will try to find the books written by the author, or books written about the author, and I take a list and go to the library and search for them. And if I wouldn't borrow them, I would first take them and study all the books, and later on I will borrow a few of them that I think I will.
Right, okay, yeah, because you don't know which ones are useful until you have a little look or something. Okay, but you would start with Google and with Wikipedia. Okay. Tuje?
Also, databases are very helpful. In library, we can model database systems.
Okay, we'll come back to that in a minute. Firstly, hands up then, the rest of you. If, like Erdem, your first, and I'm not saying this is good or bad, I'm just asking the question, if your first natural reaction to this kind of a project would be to go to Google and or Wikipedia, okay, so is that a good starting point, you think? Yes, okay, so most of you are agreeing on that, okay, it seems to be. Would you then look at the library, go to see the books, think about the library or not? Don't, if you say no, don't think David will be angry because he's library director or something like that. I'm just trying to get a picture here, or whatever, okay. But in most cases, we would start with Google, okay. Would you do the general Google? I mean, we've got Google here. Oh, this is Turkish Google, of course. Let's put it in English because I'm more familiar with that myself, but you might use that one. So you just go to the basic web Google, is that right? What other things does Google offer that might be more focused?
There's Google Books, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, up here we've got Google Books and also Google Scholar, okay? We'll mention about that in a minute, but Google Books is perhaps the most famous one. And that obviously gives you some kind of access to electronic books, things that they've scanned and put there and things like that. But, whoops. But in most cases you would begin with Google. So let's try, shall we? That'll do. $499,000 hits. Okay, So you're obviously not going to be reading all of those by next week, are you? Interestingly enough, and the way they've done it recently, of course, is that you do see if there's something specifically in Wikipedia on that subject, it's usually at the top. So this isn't just a random generated list. They are trying to sort of control it more. So you've got the entry for the Communist Manifesto, and then connected to that, the entry for Karl Marx. So even if you didn't think to yourself, I'll go to Wikipedia, Google would send you there as well, okay? I use Wikipedia, okay? If I want to know about something that's not something that I know a lot about, I might do Google or I might do Wikipedia. So I'm agreeing with you in that, okay? What's the one problem with Wikipedia, how we pronounce it? What's the... Yeah, yes. Anyone, in theory, can contribute to that. So it's not a proper, serious, scholarly thing. Okay, they have references and things like that, but who's doing it and who's changing it is not clear. There was not an academic example, but there was an example a couple of years ago, I think, in Britain, I read in the news, where I think maybe the Prime Minister or someone at the time, or one of the party leaders, said something in Parliament about someone in the past, and gave the dates of this person when he lived or something. And then one of the younger politicians from that political party checked on Wikipedia, and oh dear, he got it wrong. It was the wrong year he died or something. So then he went into Wikipedia and he changed the date to make it the same as what the guy had said in Parliament. So if anyone looked, it would look as if he was getting it right or something. But this all came out and they corrected it and things. But that's an extreme example, but it's true. Okay? Wikipedia is a useful reference point, but it certainly isn't the end, and it certainly isn't absolutely scholarly in that way. If we scroll down here, I don't know what else we get. Just okay, well this is an interesting one. I don't know what this is.
There's actually Encyclopedia Britannica has a web page, and actually it's very. There's also some I don't know, paid membership, but still.
Well, we do have subscription to that, or we should still have to that through the library as well. It's not as obviously we got the printed ones and so on. But, this is okay. So here is the text. Here is audio. You can listen to the whole of it if you want. You can look at it in Word or in PDF and so on. The other problem with the internet, and we'll talk about this in our next topic starting next week as well, I would presume, I don't know about this website, but if you're calling yourself Marxist.org, then it's probably run by people who are Marxists, okay? And they want to promote Marx's ideas and things like that. There is a lot of things on the internet which is not reliable because it's wrong, but just because people are subjective, okay? We all believe in different things, whether it's social revolution, evolution, one God, anything like that. And there are lots of websites that are existing only or mostly to promote, encourage those ideas, that ideology. And the internet offers it can be a very dangerous place because you find this, oh, that looks interesting, but what you're really getting is propaganda. It's the ideas of those people rather than objective facts or whatever you want to call those things. But we all do it. We've all admitted in this room, I think most of us, that we would look in Google in many cases and we would go to Wikipedia and so on, okay? But with 500,000 hits, 500,000 hits, okay, we can't read all of those. We have to be selective. We can rely perhaps on what Google does, but it's not going to be the only end. Okay, yep?
Maybe I can narrow it down.
How would you narrow it down? How could we narrow it down? Tercüme?
At the bottom.
Hang on, I've gone back too far. You mean here, so we search Google again, as we did before. Now,
Search within results.
search within results. Okay, give me a suggestion then. What are we going to do here? Any ideas? Anyone help Seda on this one?
We can write Communist Manifesto.
All right. Well, we've already got manifesto in there, but let's try.
There will still be a few 100,000.
Probably, yeah. Let's see what that does for us. Well, hang on. How did that happen? How have we got more? I don't understand that. Okay, this is the wonder of Google. It gives you more rather than less or something like that. But okay, yeah, you can try. It all depends on what you type in. Okay, because we knew perfectly well that typing in Karl Marx manifesto would get lots of hits. Okay, you need to be more specific in that way. Okay.
Actually, by using quotation marks, you can narrow it down because when you write Communist Manifesto, it brings you the web pages that include both communist and
Yeah,
manifesto.
okay. So search as a phrase. So by putting in... Oh, yeah, how do we do this on the Turkish keyboard? No. Do we need double quotes for that? Where is double?
It's the button left of one.
This-
Under the escape button.
What?
You need to press shift and the button under the escape.
Right, this one. No.
Would you press shift?
No, it doesn't need shift. Without shift on this computer. All right, and let's delete that. See what we come up with this time then. Well, that's good. 858, it says. Is this? But we may be searching within the results. I'm not sure. Okay. Still a lot to look at, though, isn't it? Still a lot to go through and things like that. Okay. Okay. Let's go back to my beloved library. Okay, that was not very clear. What resources? We've started answering this question. What resources does the library provide you with? How is the library useful? Okay, we've got the cafe, so you can go and have your sandwich there, but I don't mean that. Intellectual resources is what we spend most of our money on. If you wanted to use things that the library gives you, what are they? We've had some of those mentioned already. Books, yeah, books, that's the traditional one.
Electronic resources and even movies.
Okay, we'll call that multimedia movies and things like that. And yeah, electronic resources, we need to narrow that down. Tujay, you mentioned databases. What does that mean? Can we be more specific? Okay, articles. Where do articles happen? Where do we find articles? Makale. In periodicals, okay. And just as books are both electronic and print, so it's the same for journals, okay. You know, in this first floor, upstairs, we have printed journals, the new ones, the ones that haven't been bound, and at the bottom, you may or may not know, we've got the old ones there that have been bound together, and so on. But mostly, we spend a lot of our money on electronic journals. There are articles there, and so on. How do we find those? If you wanted to find an electronic journal article about Karl Marx, Communist Manifesto, from the library website, how do we find that? Do you know?
Search all electronic resources.
Right, okay, there is a thing there called Quick Search. It's not perfect. We're working on these things, and it might change in the coming few months by next year, but there is something called Search All Electronic Resources. That's a slight exaggeration, okay? It doesn't cover all of them. We'll come to that in a minute. If you wanted to be more focused, well, let's do that one now, and then we can come back, because it opens in a new screen. So let's type in... This is a little slow, so it can open up, and we can come back to that while that's doing. How else can we find electronic journal articles? Any other way? Do we know? Have you ever done it? If you wanted to find electronic journal article here.
I used to search within JSTOR and there was...
So how do you get to JSTOR? How do we find...
Was it databases by title link? I don't know.
Okay. We can either go here, research, electronic journals or the here databases, or else, since it's one of the most common things, we have it here. Okay, databases by, whoops, this is still trying to do its thing. Right, you have to accept our conditions, but no one ever reads those things, of course. And then you get the lists set out that way. If you don't know about JSTOR, you know your subject. Let's try by subject. Okay, and again, accept. And what are we going to think about? International relations, political science. Political science is Karl Marx, I suppose. And what do we get? We get a list of these things, including JSTOR. Okay, that's there, whatever. Let's, in the meantime, see what the searching has done, if it's done anything for us. Okay, well, we've got here 576 resources. So that's a lot less than Google gave us, okay, which may be good or bad. Here are some articles. Okay, you need to look at some of these. You can then narrow the subject if you think certain things. If you want very recent publications, you can say, well, I don't want something from 1908 or whatever it is. Let's just come down to the past 15 years or so, more recent things. If you want to be up to date, you can then search again, and it's searching again, I'm afraid, so we'll have to wait for a minute, and that must be the result. Okay, some of them are similar, some of them are different ones, I suspect. I'm not sure, I'm not saying you have to use this, because in fact, it's not a perfect thing, the system. This is called federated search. Okay, and what it does is, here are all the databases, JSTOR and all the other ones. And what we're doing here is, okay, here's you with your computer. We're just going to JSTOR. Okay. And then if you look in JSTOR and you don't find anything, then you might go to Periodicals Archive and go and look at that one, or EBSCO. And you go through each one separately, okay, until you find the things you want. And that might take you hours doing the same searches. What federated searching is meant to do it sends the same search to all the databases at the same time. And you could even cut some out. Say, well, we don't want to search engineering database. That's not relevant to this subject. Save time, okay? Then all of these do their search. Then they send the results back. Some of them are quick. Some of them take a bit longer. And then it finally federates them, aggregates them all together into one big list, which is what we've got over, hopefully, over here, okay? And this time, we've got 257, okay, fully, because we've narrowed it down by date and so on. Has anyone ever done this? Have you used search all resources? Have you ever used that for anything? All electronic resources?
I personally never done that. I used to search individual
Databases, yeah. I mean, that might be quicker if you know what you're looking for, but it might not give you everything, because there might be something in a database you don't look at that won't come back. But then if you've got a big list, you're like similar to Google, not as bad as Google, things like that. Okay. All right, we'll finish there. What I've been trying to, partly for me, is to understand what you're all familiar with and see how we can then use what we've got to make things better for the students of the future, okay? To improve this, but also to make sure people know about this as well. This is not perfect at the moment, this federated searching. We're looking into other options. Even the possibility of connecting up to Google Scholar and looking for things. We haven't done that one yet. Let's just finish off, in fact, by going to what I call Google Scholar, which is here. Okay, we do our usual search. It's very quick. It's much quicker. Now see what this does. It gives book results and so on. And we can't see, I have to move on this side. It also tells us some of the databases. It also gives us some of the databases that we already have.
These are free databases, right?
No, it also has, JSTOR has not come up now, but JSTOR is searched, and if the library subscribes to JSTOR, then you can look on Google Scholar, and then it will take you straight there. So 3 ways to reach JSTOR. Go to the library page and open up JSTOR. Okay, there's some error there. I don't know what that is. I'll have to look into that when I get to the library. Or you go and search for everything on our federated searching. Or JSTOR articles are also available, but not immediately, but they can be found by looking at Google Scholar and working on that one as well. Okay. These will give you different things, not websites. They are mainly articles in journals and things like that. Okay. Seda?
Can I open JSTOR from
Well, it depends where your home is. If your home is off campus, then you...
Actually, you can do that using virtual private network.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, we can set you up an account, password and so on, and then if you do that, then you can sit in Kuzalai at your home or whatever, and it's as if you're in campus. It imagines you're here and things like that. Otherwise, you need to be within the campus network. That's the problem. Okay, so this kind of thing needs to be done in Bilkent, or you can have off-campus access, but you need to ask for that. You need to arrange that and things like that. So it all depends on where you live and so on. Okay, that's been quite useful. I've got some information from you all and maybe shown a few things to you because we're working on this. And one of the things we're hoping to do with the library, maybe next year or the year after, is with the Bustle Prep program and with FAE, Faculty Academic English, which all of you have to take, we're trying to get some library element there, some teaching about the library resources, teaching about Google as opposed to other things, so that people will have a stronger understanding of how to do their research for this kind of project. Karl Marx, go away and do it, and things like that, okay? And we're hoping that'll be useful in some way. We don't know how we're going to do it yet. We might do it with librarians, we might use Moodle, we might have things online where you can have little tutorials online. We're working on that. But understanding how you all work is the first stage in doing that. So we might even make a little survey or something. And if you see a survey, library survey, think, oh, David did that, I'll fill in the survey to help my old teacher. Okay, thanks. So, Erdem and Sibel, you've got some work to do in the next few days. Okay, work together. We've got your presentation on Monday. Yaz and Sefa are not here today, but I did get to see them earlier in the week, so I hope they'll be working as well. If you've got any problems, any concerns, send me an email. And if I can help in some way, I'll try and help. Okay, I'll do my best. Otherwise, see you all 10:40 Monday for our 2 presentations. Have a nice weekend.